It used to be something most journalists took for granted. If you have an opinion, you keep it to yourself. And don't show up at rallies or political events unless you're covering them. But now, as journalistic objectivity gets a rethink, the Washington Post has issued guidelines letting reporters know what's fair participation and what's not. Adam has more.
A new Post memo obtained by the Daily Beast's Max Tani makes it sound simple. It's okay for Post employees to participate in celebratory parades or festivals, but not in events that are partisan or political. On closer examination, though, it's not simple at all. For example, Post management says staff can attend Juneteenth celebrations because they are non-political, even though the holiday figures prominently in debates over racial reckoning.
Finding out on this day 155 years ago that they were free.
Also getting the green light as non-political, Pride celebrations, whose core premise is pretty political too.
We could not even hold hands in public, let alone consider getting married.
The memo adds that while attending a celebration on D.C.'s Black Lives Matter Plaza is acceptable, attending a protest there isn't, which is odd since the area's name is an act of protest in and of itself.
Making sure our nation is more fair and more just.
The big problem for the Post is that there is no safe, apolitical space in life for journalists or anyone else. Try to create one, and people may wonder if you really understand politics at all.
Adam, this is a real tough one newsrooms all over America have had to do this because things have changed so dramatically. Opinion journalism has really replaced straightforward journalism almost everywhere. So what's the difference between offering an opinion and participating in something that has a political bent? I know our organization has tried to address this. I'm sure everybody, I commend them for trying. What would you do instead?
You're right. This is not a problem limited to the Post. We're picking on them because the details of their attempts to grapple with it came out publicly in a way that other organizations haven't. I think there's a few different ways you can go. I would not fault any news organization that said to its employees, you're expected to be seen as a critical, fair, detached chronicler of public events. It's not appropriate for you to participate in any public displays at all, period. I think that would frustrate a lot of people. Yeah. It would be consistent. You could go the other route, too, and say to your employees, bear in mind that anything you do when you're out in public could result in people being less inclined to accept your reporting, which is your profession. That being said, you're adults. Think this through and be careful out there. The problem for the Post, to my mind, is that they tried to have it both ways. They tried to say, okay, you can tiptoe up to a certain line and there you're completely safe. But then when you go past that line, when you go from celebrations to demonstrations, you've gone from the realm of the apolitical to the political. Right. And as soon as you start to kick the tires on that, it's just a nonsensical premise.
Agree.
So I don't know exactly what I would do if I ran a newsroom. I wouldn't do what the Post did.
Yeah, look, I'm incredibly sympathetic to this as someone who did run a newsroom last year and was asking people, Black journalists to go out and cover demonstrations about how they didn't have a right to exist, right? Like white supremacy rallies. So, look, I think it's a really complicated issue. It just feels like they missed the mark here. As Wes Lowery said on Twitter, to say that a pride celebration is not political is an ahistorical stance for a newspaper, right? Like if you're Black, you're Asian, you're LGBTQI, in this country, you celebrate Pride, the people who are going to have a problem with you going to a protest are also going to have a problem with you going to a celebration, right? So it sort of feels like this policy is about optics and not reality. There are real conversations with really, frankly, Wes Lowery kicked off at the Post about how we define objectivity in a time where people want to at least be able to be honest about their identities and can embrace fairness and truth, but also don't have to deny their basic humanity. And those conversations are just much more nuanced than this policy, I think, allowed for.
This was a question that was asked, 5, 10, certainly 15 and 20 years ago. It was pretty clear cut. If you were a reporter, you weren't involved in any kinds of activities, political activities, protests, anything like that, because it could be seen as some kind of bias if you were covering those stories. So it was pretty clear cut in the past. And I think even now you can't really come up with a real sort of universal policy. I think it really has to be case by case. Where newsrooms have to be very transparent and open and have conversations around all of the cases. So I know it becomes quite controversial to have those conversations, but I think, if something is happening at the time on the national level, something happening on the local level, that news directors, news managers have to step up and say, let's have a conversation. How do we feel about this? And if, in fact, you will be participating, how will we handle that? So I think it's important for newsrooms not to have, put out just a policy, but to have a conversation.
It was about a year ago that the Boston Globe put out a statement saying that their reporters could attend Black Lives Matter demonstrations. And although I think a lot of us were surprised when that happened because of the traditional rules that govern us, which all of the rest of us have already mentioned, I think it made a certain amount of sense. I would suggest that if anybody thinks that Black Lives Matter is partisan or anti-police, maybe they ought to think inside themselves as to what they're saying when they say that. I think the Washington Post got it wrong in some ways, but I do think that some sort of a case-by-case analysis is absolutely necessary here. I don't see how you can have a blanket rule saying anything goes or you can't do any of these activities. I think that it has to be nuanced. It has to be taken as, well, is this an expression of identity or is it an expression of pure politics? And the decision has to be made on that basis.
Yeah, maybe they need to ask permission every time. That would be tedious, but maybe that's what it is.